Okay, so this lecture is going to focus in on the spinal nerves. So we should have just covered the brain and the cranial nerves, and so now we're still firmly within this central nervous system, at least for most of this lecture. But this is going to build off of the trailing end of the brain and cranial nerves lecture, and talk about spinal nerves, talk about the spinal cord in general, its organization and whatnot, and then how it interacts with the peripheral nervous system. So the spinal cord is that vital link that we see between the brain and the rest of the body. In and of itself, in certain cases, the spinal cord is actually is independent. That is, it functions independently of the brain to make certain decisions that don't need to go to the brain. So we'll talk about those as we get there, right? But otherwise, it is that link that brings information. Typically, again, we're talking about sensory information coming up into the brain, right? To be integrated, to be processed, to be used, to respond to, and then motor information leaving the brain through the spinal cord and out to the peripheral nervous system so that a response can be made, a response in terms of muscle movement or glandular secretion. Now, on the actual spinal cord, we see that its external surface has two longitudinal depressions, and I can point them out to you here. So here is one of those depressions here, and then we see that other depression here. Now this is the posterior side of the spinal cord. You can tell because this is the spinal process or spinous process of the actual vertebra, and so obviously that has to stick out posteriorly, and therefore that this depression here is the posterior median sulcus, right? That is the term, posterior median sulcus. The term dorsal is also used here, so it can be called posterior median sulcus. It can also be called dorsal median sulcus. I will always use posterior, so posterior median sulcus. So we see that here, and then this one here, obviously by extension, if that's posterior, then this depression over on this side of the spinal cord is going to be the anterior median fissure or sulcus. You may use the term fissure or sulcus with respect to these terms interchangeably. Again, I always refer to it as the sulcus, but whatever. So this is the anterior median fissure or sulcus. Sometimes it's also referred to as the ventral median sulcus or fissure, but I won't do that. I will refer to it as the anterior median sulcus. Now, the function of the spinal cord, again, as we've talked about, is that it's a pathway for sensory information coming into the central nervous system. It's also a pathway for motor responses leaving the central nervous system. It's also responsible for reflexes, and so we're going to talk about reflexes, and that's when we get kind of heavy into talking about the independence of the spinal cord in certain cases. Now, when we look at regions of the spinal cord, we associate it with, again, those types of vertebra that we see in the vertebral column. And so the spinal cord has 31 pairs of spinal nerves that connect the central nervous system to all the periphery. So that is the muscles, the receptors, the glands. In the cervical region, we have 8 cervical spinal nerves, right? So C1 through C8 is the numbering. I'm not going to ask you to number any of these. I just want you to know that there are, in fact, 8 of them. And this region is continuous with the medulla oblongata. The thoracic region has 12 thoracic spinal nerves, so T1 through T12. So again, 8 plus 12 here, that's 20 so far that we've covered. The lumbar region has an additional 5 lumbar spinal nerves, L1 through L5. So, and then again, we can see on this figure, C1 through C8, T1 through T12, and now we've already covered L1 through L5. And that leaves us with the sacral region. This is an additional 5 spinal nerves that we see down here highlighted in pink, S1 through S5. And then finally, the coccygeal region, right? So the coccygeal region is the most inferior tip of the spinal cord, and we see that coccygeal pair right here at the very base. Now, something that's kind of interesting that I've always found kind of interesting is that the spinal cord itself is actually shorter than the vertebral canal that it lies within. So if you think about it, there's this cord that sits inside this tube, and the cord itself is actually shorter than the entirety of the tube, the canal that it sits in. And as a result there, that poses a little bit of an issue for movement. So we're going to talk about that. There are specific structures on the spinal cord that we expect you to know. The first one here is what we call the conus medullaris, right? And this is the tapering cone-like end of the spinal cord. And so we see this conus medullaris right here. Now, right off of the conus medullaris, this tapering end, you see this kind of fraying set of threads that seem to be coming off. And this very much looks, if you kind of look at it, minus the fact that it looks like actual tissue, it kind of looks a little bit like a horse's tail. And that's an important analogy to make here, because these set of axons that are running inferiorly out to the legs, this is known as the cauda equina, literally horse's tail. And these are axons that run inferiorly off of the conus medullaris to go down to the leg, and then the very inferior most portion of the pelvic region. Now, within the cauda equina, right, so within this horsetail-like structure, is a single, and you can tell here it's a slightly different colored structure. It's almost a little bit whiter or grayer here. This is called the filum terminale. And the filum terminale itself is simply a thin strand of pia mater. So it's an extension of that pia mater that we've talked about in the brain, in one of those meninges. And this is actually the anchor. So this actually anchors the conus medullaris to the coccyx at the very, very base of the vertebral column. And so this allows us now to make sure that when we, say, bend over, right, so we bend forward, right, or we bend backward, it doesn't really matter either way, although it's obviously much more drastic if we bend forward. When we bend forward, that the spinal cord itself doesn't slip upward and forward in the vertebral canal. Because if that were to happen, if you can imagine for a moment bending that tube, and when you do so, the spinal cord itself, or that cord on the inside of that tube, actually changes position. It would now begin to pull on all of the actual spinal nerves, and this would be very bad. This would be very, very bad for us. So that's what that filum terminale does. It serves as an anchor. Now, there are meninges in the spinal cord as well, and these are continuous with the cranial meninges. For all intents and purposes, they are the exact same meninges, and so this is the point that I want to kind of really drive home, right? Now, we're going to start from the outermost layer, the superficialmost layer, and work our way deep, just like we did with the meninges in the skull. So, obviously, the very first layer of protection on the very outside of this whole structure is the vertebra, the bone themselves, right? And so the vertebral bones there are actually that first layer. And just deep to the vertebral columns is a space, right? That little space between that and the first meninges is called the epidural space. And most of you, I'm sure, have heard about this. Many of you probably have some kind of experience with this one way or the other. The epidural space, right? It's named, there's a procedure that's named specifically for it, the epidural. So women that are in the process or in labor, right, can elect to get an epidural. This is a shot that's given between the spaces of the vertebra. And this shot is a local anesthetic at a relatively low point on the spinal cord given in that epidural space. And the idea is that it delivers this anesthetic to the inferiormost cranial nerve so that we see a great deal less pain for the woman giving birth, right? Should she elect to get it. Now, it's not required, it's not necessary by any means, but it can make the whole process much more comfortable. And so, that, again, that's the term of the significance of that epidural space. Now, just deep to the epidural space, we see the dura mater, which we've already discussed, same dura mater that's on the brain. Deep to that is the subdural space, again, exact same structure. Deep to that is the arachnoid mater, or arachnoid. Same structure here as well. Then the subarachnoid space, and then finally the pia mater. So it's really only the vertebra and epidural space that differ here. Now, there is gray matter in the spinal cord just like there is gray matter in the brain. And there is white matter in the spinal cord. Again, just like there is white matter on the brain. However, in this case, it's kind of interesting. This is a very flip-flopped scenario. So where on the brain, the vast majority of the gray matter that we see is located around the external portions of the brain. On the cortex of the cerebrum, for example, the cortex of the cerebellum. Well, here, the actual gray matter in the spinal cord is actually innermost or interiormost, and we see that right here. This is that gray matter structure, right? And it's shaped like an H, forgive me, shaped like an H. It's shaped like a butterfly. It's kind of another more common term. That's usually the way I refer to it, as a butterfly, because it is kind of shaped that way. Now, this gray matter itself is actually divided into the following components. So we see some areas that we actually actively identify. Now, I want to make it a point to again orient you. This is the anterior surface of the spinal cord, as indicated by the anterior median fissure here. And so if you see the bottom of these wings are much more rounded here and here. And this very horn here, or here, they're called horns, they're points basically. Here or here, these are the anterior horns. And then the structures just lateral to that, here or here, somewhat of the side of that lower portion of the wing here. That is the lateral horn here and the lateral horn here. And then finally, on the posterior side of the spinal cord, we have the very top tips of the wings here and here. And these are the posterior horns. And the small space here, the small strip of gray matter that it's connecting these two sides, this is called the gray commissure, right? Think of commissure like to commiserate, to communicate. That's what the commissure does. It allows these two sides of the gray matter to communicate. And right through the center of it is a very small canal. It's an open space. It's that continuance of those ventricles in the brain. Now, this is a small canal of space here through the spinal cord. It's called the central canal. This is also filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Now, the white matter itself, again, and unfortunately in this view, it's a little bit weird because this is an actual cross-section of spinal cord and it's been stained so that you can see the differences here. So unfortunately here it doesn't appear white, but it would be. These much more purple areas, here, here, all the way around here, and then around here again, this is all the white matter, and this is external or superficial to the gray matter and the spinal cord. So again, complete reverse of the brain. And the white matter on each side, again, is partitioned into three regions, unfortunately, as you would expect, right? Posterior side is here, right? We can see posterior. Posterior side is here. My apologies. This is the posterior funiculus. Now, if we were to go to the very opposite side of the spinal cord, we see this region here is actually the anterior funiculus. And then finally, these lateral portions here and lateral portions here are called the lateral funiculus, right? So lateral, lateral, posterior, anterior, right? Pretty simple. Again, very similar to the horns of the gray matter. Now, the spinal nerves themselves are actually they're actual nerves, right? So these are bundles of thousands of motor and sensory axons all grouped together, right, as you'd expect. And they serve specific regions of the body. That's the idea. I mean, you would expect that cervical nerves are not going to be serving the legs because they're so high up on the body, and that's exactly what we see. So they're there to serve reasonably close regions to where the nerve is actually located. Now, the motor axons themselves are actually going to originate from the spinal cord. And so if we look at it here, so here is that whole spinal nerve here, and then we've got these roots that we need to talk about here. And again, we need to make sure that we pay attention to where these roots lie in terms of surface on the spinal cord. So here is an anterior root, and we can tell that because this is the anterior surface of the spinal cord, and we can tell that because this is the body of the vertebra, which again would be anterior on the body. And here is the posterior root that we see here, and these two are going to unite here within that intervertebral foramen and become this spinal nerve that then radiates outward. Again, it is both motor and sensory axons that exist here because we have to have sensory input coming into the central nervous system, and by the same extension, we also have to have motor responses coming out of the central nervous system. So both of these axons must exist. Each spinal nerve itself is associated with the vertebra of the same numbers. That's why you see those numbering on those spinal nerves. One of my favorite figures ever, right? Big one because it's particularly useful, but two because it's just probably the worst superhero costume ever, is one way to think about it. These are dermatomes, right? And so these colored regions, it's very interesting. These colored regions are actually segments of skin that are associated with a particular single spinal nerve. And so we can see where on the body we would expect to see sensory information going through a specific spinal nerve, and then obviously motor information coming to that region from a very specific spinal nerve. Now, all spinal nerves except for C1 are going to innervate a segment of the skin. So each of these nerves is associated with a dermatome. So here's a good example, right? We see C2 as the ears here, and then this very inferior surface of the mandible all the way up here, and then back up to this other ear. So it's a relatively small patch. And then here's C3, just that collar on the neck. And then C4 begins to show up a little bit just above where the clavicle bone is. And then we've got C5, which all of a sudden begins to extend all the way down the arms. So it depends how much region is associated with a nerve is dependent upon which nerve it is. Now, this is collectively known. All of these regions are all collectively known as a dermatome map. Now, if you think about it, so far I've only talked about 31 pairs of spinal nerves, which in all total, if it's 31 pairs, you've actually got 62 individual nerves coming off the spinal cord. And so if you try to think about it, are 62 nerves just by themselves, without branching off any more from that, are those 62 nerves going to be able to hit every organ, every portion of the body, every muscle, and so on and so forth? Well, no, obviously not. Our body is much bigger than what 62 nerves could possibly serve. And so those spinal nerves must branch. And that branching network that we see is called a nerve plexus. And it's a network of interweaving anterior and posterior branches, often referred to as rami, of spinal nerves. The anterior rami, which again we're going to see some relatively complicated anterior rami because the spinal cord is located in the posterior portion of the body. So it's got more surface area to cover on the anterior side. So the anterior rami, the anterior branch, is and are going to be much larger, right? And they're going to form nerve plexuses both on the left and right side of the body, as well as the anterior portions of the trunk, upper and lower limbs as well. Posterior rami are small, and they only really innervate small patches of small patches of skin and small muscles in the back. They don't form plexuses because it's not that complicated. Remember, the spinal cord is already located in the back of the body, and so therefore you don't need to branch out that much because the distance isn't far from the from the actual spinal cord itself. Now, here are the principal plexuses, and again, I don't really focus on these on an exam by any means, but it's just kind of useful to see. We see the principal plexuses being the cervical plexuses, so we see some associated with the neck. The brachial plexuses, for those of you that remember, brachial region is in fact the arm. The lumbar region, this is the lower back. We're going to think of this area where the lumbar vertebrae are. And then finally the sacral plexuses, that area near the sacrum. So we've got a couple that are relatively high on the human body, right? We're talking about neck and upper arms. And then we're talking about very low on the body. So they're near the lower back and the sacrum. Now, reflexes are cool. I think reflexes are very cool. I hope you find them the same way. They're used often enough as kind of a clinical means of figuring out if there is in fact something wrong with your peripheral nervous system and or a portion of your central nervous system, right? Because they're very useful. The thing about reflexes that make them so useful for that purpose is that they're automatic, involuntary responses, which means they should occur the same way every time. We're going to talk about that. Reflexes have the same kinds of properties, and as a result of that, they become very, very useful in diagnostic medical tests because they are, in fact, supposed to be the same thing every time, right? So think of this: rapid, so fast; autonomic, that is automatic; involuntary reactions of the muscles or glands to a stimulus. Again, rapid, automatic, involuntary. So we're not thinking about it, it happens fast, and it automatically happens every time. These are the similar properties that we should see. Okay, let's talk about those properties. Break this down a little more so that you get a better sense. These are the properties that all reflexes must exhibit. First, in order for a reflex to occur, there must be a stimulus that precedes the actual reflex, that initiates the response. So that is, for those of you that have been to the doctor, right? Every one of us has had this happen who has seen a medical professional. If you sit down, they have you sit down, and then they'll go ahead and they'll use that silly little triangular shaped rubber mallet, and they'll whack your knee. They'll hit your knee with it, and you kick. This is the patellar. They're checking that patellar ligament, right? And in this case, if they don't hit your leg with that little hammer, you're not going to kick, right? Because there's been no stimulus to respond to it. So that doctor has to hit your patellar ligament in order to start the reflex. Now, once that stimulus occurs, a rapid response then will ensue. And that rapid response requires that only a few neurons be involved. And the reason that only a few neurons are involved is that it truly minimizes what we call that synaptic delay. The number of the delays resulting from the number of synapses that are along that pathway. And then finally, an automatic response that occurs the same way every time should be the ending portion of that reflex. So in this case, using this example that I've already used, the kick. Right? Doctor hits you with that little mallet, that's the stimulus. The response is that you get the stimulus coming in, that rapid response is sent back out, and the automatic response is the kick. And that kick happens the same way every time. It should happen the same way every time. Now, the cool thing about a reflex is that it requires no intent. So you don't have to intend to do the reflex. It requires no pre-awareness. You don't have to know that it's coming. You don't even have to know that it's happening in order for the reflex to occur. It is supposed to be involuntary, and that's why it's so importantly used in diagnostic tests, because it is involuntary. You do not need intent. You do not even need awareness of it going on in order for it to happen. Now, reflexes should not be suppressed. They should not be easily able to be suppressed, because by the time you're typically aware that it's happening, it's already begun. Now, awareness of that stimulus occurs after the reflex action has been completed. So typically we feel the hit right after we've kicked. Right? So after that reflex action has been completed, then all of a sudden we actually feel that stimulus hitting us. That's how fast it occurs. Now, reflexes are used to test specific muscle groups. They're used to test specific spinal nerves or the segment of the spinal nerve. So we're looking to see, again, is there damage to just muscle? Is it damage to a specific spinal nerve? Is it damage to a segment of the spinal cord altogether? Right? That's the kind of information that they're looking to get at. And so this is part of that diagnostic tests to help figure that out or elucidate that. Now, a consistently abnormal reflex response on the part of a patient could potentially indicate that there's damage to either the nervous system or the muscles of that area. So this is obviously, again, very important, very key. The idea that, is this consistently abnormal in this patient? And if so, why? Would be something to look into. Now, an individual can have a normal response. That is, quote unquote, we think of as normal, what we think of as fitting kind of the norm of most people. It could be hypoactive, right? So hypo means less than active, right? So this could be a lot less active than we expect. So there's a normal kick, there's a kind of a subtle, less than active kick, and then there's a hyperactive kick. There's that hyperactive reflex response that is it's far in excess of what we'd expect, right? Now, again, doesn't mean that any one of these is bad. It's just that a reflex response by an individual could be any one of these things. And a hypoactive or hyperactive reflex response isn't necessarily bad. It just is what it is. It all depends on if there is, in fact, something wrong with that particular reflex that's causing it to be hypoactive or hyperactive. Okay, so we need, in order to talk about this meaningfully, we need to break down the components of a reflex arc, right? So this arc means basically we're talking about the wiring. So starting with the receptor all the way through that sensory neuron, and then going out into the motor neuron for response out to the effector. This is the pathway, the arc, so to speak. This is the neural wiring of that single reflex. Now, again, going back to that notion of what are the properties of all reflexes? Number one is there must be a stimulus to activate that response. So there must be a stimulus that begins in order to cause a response in that reflex. So we always start in the PNS, or the peripheral nervous system. That receptor, once the stimulus hits that receptor from that sensory neuron, that information is going to be communicated all the way to the central nervous system. Now, maybe it's just spinal cord level here. Maybe it goes all the way to the brain, but either way, it's still going to the central nervous system. Now, a motor neuron is going to carry the response out to the peripheral effector, and this is essentially the end of the actual reflex arc, the muscle or gland at the end of the arc. So let's talk about some of these very specific types of reflex arcs. So in the case of an ipsilateral reflex arc, this is the type of reflex arc in which both the receptor, so that is the actual part of the body that's actually receiving the stimulus externally, right, and the effector organs are on the same side of the spinal cord. So a good example of this, and actually I actually legitimately hate the example given in your book. I keep it in here specifically because I want to make a point. We're going to go back to this. Would be when you feel pain on, say, your right arm, right? And you pull your arm away in response to get it away from that pain. Now, you got to be careful a little bit with pain. In the example I just gave you, you felt the pain, that is the stimulus, on the right arm, and then moved your right arm away in order to pull it away from the source of that pain, right? But unfortunately, you have to be a bit careful with pain because this is not something that is actually a reflex. Because the problem with reflexes, remember we talked about this when we first defined it, is that a reflex is actually where where a response occurs the same way every time. And the problem is that doesn't necessarily isn't always the case with pain, and it certainly isn't always the case across people. People have a great threshold in terms of between individual people, a great threshold for pain, where some people feel pain very sensitive to pain, and it's very intense for them, and some people have a very dull sensation of pain, and so they have a larger threshold for pain. They can tolerate a great deal more pain. But remember, you're not supposed to be able to suppress a reflex. And the problem here is that in this particular case, in the example that your book gives you, that when the muscles in your left arm contract to pull your left hand away from a hot object. So let's say that hot object is a flame. Now, the problem here is that you can will and force yourself to hold your hand over a flame and in that direct pain. So you can actually burn your hand by forcing your arm to stay where it is. And that, by definition, breaks the idea of what a reflex is supposed to be. You can't will yourself to not kick your leg when they tap your patellar ligament, say in a doctor's office. Right? It doesn't matter how much you want to will yourself to not move that leg, you are still going to move that leg. This is an instance where, unfortunately, that is not the case. However, the central point here being when it's an ipsilateral reflex arc, both the receptor and the effector organs are on the same side of the body, i.e. the same side of the spinal cord. Now, a contralateral reflex arc is exactly the opposite thing, right? So we expect that the receptor organ is going to be on one side of the spinal cord, that is one side of the body, and the effector organ is going to be on the opposite side of the body. So the best example is, and this is one I know all too well, unfortunately, the idea that let's say you step on a nail with your left foot, right? So you're walking through, say, an area, like for me, for example, when I was in graduate school, I did a lot of sampling of snake species, right? And so I'd go out in meadows and prairies and whatnot, and I would collect snakes, and that was part of my research to get data from those individual snakes. Now, sometimes, when you're walking through some of these areas, some of them are nice, relatively pristine, natural areas, and some of them are kind of run down. Some of them used to be all old Boy Scout camps or old paintball gun uh, uh, facilities and all kinds of things. And so there could be trash laying about, there could be old boards laying about, and those old boards might have nails through them, and you might not necessarily know that they're there. And so in several instances with myself, I can recall where I would actually step, and in this case, we're going to use my left foot as the example. I'd step my left foot on a nail, and I didn't know it, of course, until it pierced my foot, and then the pain came through, and then, that was always a fun time. But here's the point: when that occurred, the reflex was that my right leg stiffen up and the muscles contract in such a way to allow me to maintain my balance so that I could pull my left leg away from that nail, that damage that I had just inflicted upon myself, right? So here you see the effector. The effector is on the right side of the body. That's the leg that's straightening and it's helping to allow maintain your balance, because it's the left leg that you're perceiving the pain from. Contralateral, right? So opposite sides of the body. Okay, so those were two different types of reflex arcs. But now we want to talk about how those reflex arcs are composed in terms of the number of synapses. So that is, how many neurons in order is that reflex? How many synapses are involved in that reflex? We're going to start with the simplest of all reflexes, because that kind of makes sense, right? We're going to start with one in which no interneurons are involved. So we're talking about a monosynaptic. Monosynaptic reflexes have clearly one synapse. Mono for one, synaptic for synapse. So this is a situation where you have a single sensory neuron and a single motor neuron, and there is no interneurons in between. So you have literally one synapse. And the best example of that one is a stretch reflex. It's where it regulates skeletal muscle length. So a stimulus comes in where it detects the stretching of a muscle, and that muscle then in turn reflexively contracts to keep the stretch from damaging the muscle, because you don't want to tear the muscle, obviously. It's just too much stretch. And so a good example of that, a specific example of that, is the patellar, or sometimes referred to as the knee jerk reflex. This is monosynaptic. This is also a stretch reflex, right? Because they tap that patellar ligament. The muscle itself actually stretches, and by virtue of that, the actual quadriceps muscles, the rectus femoris and those vastus muscles there, they're going to contract, produce a noticeable kick. That is the reflex. Now, polysynaptic reflexes are exactly what they sound like. If it's not one synapse, it's multiple synapses in that reflex arc. This is meant to be intentionally vague, because polysynaptic means many, but we don't know how many we're talking about. Is it 2? Is it 3? Is it 4? Is it 5? Is it 7? This name would not imply that. But nonetheless, it is important to talk about them. So this is the vague way in which we talk about it. Polysynaptic reflexes, as it says, are more complex. They're definitely going to be more complex than a monosynaptic reflex, right? And they're going to involve interneurons by definition, because the second it's more than one synapse, you have got to have an interneuron in between the sensory and motor neuron. Now, because this reflex arc has more components, it's going to have a more prolonged delay between the actual stimulus and the response that comes about from it. And that's, again, it's just a byproduct of the architecture of the number of synapses in between. More synapses, the longer of a delay there is between the electrical to chemical to electrical translation for each synapse. And each delay is kind of compounded. So if it's 5 milliseconds for one and 5 milliseconds for the second polysynaptic reflex, now all of a sudden your synaptic delay is 10 milliseconds overall, versus if it was just a monosynaptic, it would be 5 milliseconds. If that kind of math makes sense. Okay, so we're out of reflexes now, and we're going to start talking about the notion of a pathway, right? So how the body actually communicates, or how the central nervous system communicates with the body. And these are either sensory or they're motor. They're not both. So keep that in mind right now. This is a very clear-cut case where it's either sensory or motor. And in these pathways, processing and integration occur continuously. This is a continuous process whereby we are going to process information, we're going to integrate it together and see if it needs to go even further up the pathway or not. So pathways are going to travel through white matter of the spinal cord and connect various central nervous system regions with the peripheral nerves that bring information in or take information away. Now, each pathway consists of what we call a tract and a nucleus. A tract is a group of axons that are going to travel together in the central nervous system. Now, each tract might actually work with multiple nuclei within the central nervous system. So that's important to keep in mind. It might actually go between multiple nuclei for processing and integration. A nucleus, again, we've talked about this, but it's good to just define it again to make sure that we remember this, is a collection of neuron cell bodies located within the central nervous system. So there's an ascending pathway. And an ascending pathway is information coming from the periphery up to the central nervous system. And by default, this must be sensory, because sensory information comes into the central nervous system. And then there's descending pathways. And descending pathways are by default motor. They have to be, because information leaving the brain out to the actual periphery, this is not sensory information. This is motor information. The sensory information has ascended up into the central nervous system, and now the motor response is descending out from that central nervous system. And often, the pathway itself is actually going to cross from one side of the body to the opposite side of the body. And this process is actually called decussation. This is a situation where, say, the left side of the brain processes information from the right side of the body and vice versa. And as it turns out, this is incredibly common. About 90% of all pathways decussate. So again, this is very important. Not only is it common, it's very much the standard. Now, pathways themselves are composed of a series of 2 or 3 neurons themselves that work together. So let's go through that. Now, when we talk about this, we have to link up this idea of somatotopy, which is where we have a precise correspondence between a specific area of the body and a specific area of the CNS. And if you think about this, a lot of this refers back to that wonderful figure that I kind of like to joke about, but it demonstrates the primary motor cortex and the primary somatosensory cortex of the brain. Because the primary somatosensory cortex, right, that is a clear demonstration of a very specific area in the central nervous system that corresponds very specifically to a specific part of the body. So that's a good example of somatotopy, right? And we have the same kind of thing with the motor cortex. Now, all pathways are paired. They must have paired tracks because you've got a right and a left side of the body, and so you must be able to control and sense both. Now, a pathway on the left side of the central nervous system has a matching tract on the right side and vice versa, again, as we'd expect. Now, sensory pathways have primary and secondary neurons, and occasionally have what we call tertiary neurons, which are upper level neurons after the fact. So sensory pathways may have 2, 3, or more neurons. Typically 3, right? At most 3. Motor pathways, on the other hand, are going to be very specific. These use 2. So motor pathways will use an upper motor neuron and then a lower motor neuron. And the cell bodies of the nuclei are associated with each pathway. So you have these cell bodies that are located within the nuclei that are associated with each pathway. So it's got to be, it has very specific nuclei that are associated with these pathways as a result. So if we delve into sensory pathways specifically, everything starts with a receptor. And this is something we want to keep in mind when we think about the sensory aspect of nervous information. Receptors are going to detect that stimuli, and they're going to conduct that nerve impulse to the CNS. Now, sensory pathway centers within either the spinal cord or within the brainstem process, they're going to filter incoming sensory information. And this is vital. This is so important because they're going to determine whether the incoming sensory stimulus should be transmitted to the cerebrum or terminated. And this is very important. For those of you, again, I like to use this example because it's just such a great, clear, contrasting example between adults and newborn children, right? So for those of you that have had a newborn child or have spent any kind of time with a newborn child, you watch a newborn child and they often look kind of overstimulated, just like it's just too much, right? That's because there is. For a newborn child, everything is new that they're experiencing. You know, every slight and subtle breeze of air or draft of air is a brand new stimulus because those kinds of things didn't happen in utero. And so as a result, they're experiencing the world, an entirely different world, and all these new stimuli in a very different way for the first time ever. And so for them, they just kind of look generally sort of, like frazzled or sort of, they just look like overloaded because they are. But adults don't often, every one of us probably knows somebody that generally always looks a little frazzled, but generally speaking, normally speaking, most of us have learned that there's a lot of things that happen to us or around us that just simply don't matter. They just simply don't matter. And this is what I'm talking about, the filtering, the progressive filtering. Because more than 99% of all incoming impulses are not going to reach the cerebral cortex, right? And as a result, are not going to become a part of our conscious awareness. We don't care. We don't care if the air temperature changes from 71.1 to 71.2 degrees Fahrenheit. It's completely negligible. The likelihood that you're going to care about a tenth of a degree change in temperature is very unlikely, right? But again, this is all conditional. And so we're going to come back to the idea that what is important is always conditional. It depends on the circumstance. Okay, so that primary neuron, often also referred to as a first order neuron, and it depends on how you think. Some people like that term first because it tells them that, hey, this is the first one. Some people like the term primary because that seems to reinforce that more. It doesn't matter which term you use. Primary neuron or first order neuron. This is the receptor neuron. So the dendrites here are a part of the receptor that detects that specific stimulus. And then that stimulus will be carried from the cell body that resides in what we call a posterior root ganglia. Right? A ganglion is a collection of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system on a spinal nerve, right? Or we'll see it in a sensory ganglia of the cranial nerves, right? So that impulse is going to be sent along to the cell body that's in the posterior root ganglia or in the sensory ganglia. Now, the axon of the primary neuron is going to project to a secondary neuron within the central nervous system. And at this point, that secondary neuron is by definition an interneuron. The cell body resides within either the posterior horn of the spinal cord, so we're talking about the cell body of the secondary neuron here, or that cell body is within a brainstem nucleus. The axon of that secondary neuron is going to project to the thalamus, right? Remember, this is that portion of the diencephalon. We saw it. It's kind of in the center of the brain, if you want to think of it as the center of the brain. And here is where it could potentially synapse with a tertiary neuron. So that's what we need to keep in mind. That tertiary or third order neuron, this is also an interneuron, because from here, it's going to be translated into motor response. Once we've passed through this tertiary neuron and it's gone from this point up into the actual cerebrum. So the tertiary neuron, its cell body resides within the thalamus. And the thalamus is that central processing and coding center for almost all sensory sensory information. And it's at this point where the ultimate decision is going to be made as to whether this is going to be sent up into the cerebral cortex or it's going to be terminated here because it does not need to be conscious. We don't need to consciously think of this particular set of stimuli. So a good example of that here is the posterior funiculus medial lemniscal pathway. Now, I'm just going to make it clear right now. I am not going to ask you about the posterior funiculus medial lemniscal pathway on any exam that I give. I give this example because it puts a name to a particular pathway. And so you can actually use this as an example to locate the primary, secondary, and tertiary neurons accordingly. Right? And so we're going to go through this as an example of such, but I'm not going to ever ask you about this specific pathway. So you see this primary neuron here, right, is its axon is entering the actual central nervous system, and at this point actually terminates here in the medulla oblongata. And this is where the secondary neuron picks up. The secondary neuron is highlighted in blue, and this secondary neuron here is going to pass all the way through the mesencephalon and then up into the actual thalamus here, right? Now, the green neuron is that tertiary neuron. Notice how it brings information from the thalamus up to the, in this case, primary somatosensory cortex, and the specific location of the primary somatosensory cortex, because this particular pathway is concerned with proprioceptive information for limb positions. You know where your limbs are located, a specific limb in particular. It talks about it, or it helps us discern discriminative touch. So, pain and such and so forth, right? Pressure, vibration sensations. Now, in the motor pathways, we're gonna see the descending pathways in the brain and the spinal cord that specifically control activities of the skeletal muscle, and these are formed from participation by both the cerebral nuclei and the cerebellum, as well as the descending projection tracts and motor neurons. And specifically, the descending projection tracts are motor pathways that originate from the cerebral cortex and brainstem. And depending on what response is being sent, this may be either a direct or an indirect pathway. So the corticospinal tract is a good example of an actual motor pathway. But again, same thing applies as compared to the posterior funiculus. I will not directly ask you about the corticospinal tract, but I put it here more as a a figure and an example that you can go through, that you can look at and compare, uh, your upper and lower motor neurons and see where these things start, where they end, and whatnot. It's a good example. Now, this is where things get really interesting, because when it comes down to it, when you bring the cerebrum into the mix, this is where all where the real decision making, or where the real thoughts, conscious thought, is coming into play here, in terms of what are we going to do, what decision are we going to make. And so when it comes down to it, several regions of the brain are going to participate in the control of these motor activities. And that in and of itself is particularly important, because these motor programs require conscious directions from the frontal lobes. So specifically, the frontal lobes are there to help us to determine whether or not we should or should not do this action. And again, the frontal lobes are a major player in the inhibition of certain activities. So specifically, it allows us to make those good conscious decision making as to whether or not we should actually do something. So should we do this? Should we not do this? And I think we can all think of a good example of a time in our adult life when we desperately wanted to do something that was a really bad idea, and we held ourselves back because, again, this frontal lobe was participating. These frontal lobes were participating in reminding us that it's not a good idea to make this decision. Now, movement is initiated when commands are received from the primary motor cortex, right? So we're talking about, again, that motor association areas within the primary motor cortex. So as we talked again about with respect to that primary motor cortex just anterior to the central sulcus. And so those motor association areas are going to send out the initial decision to do something or to not do something in terms of a response. Now, notice we've got participation in the frontal lobe telling us whether or not we should do this. And then the motor association telling us where we should do it from. And then we're going to take the cerebellum into account as well, because the cerebellum is going to be incredibly important in coordinating movements, because a lot of the responses that we are going to do are going to require some very specific and exact timing for these different muscles. When do I contract? When do I relax and whatnot in order to properly do whatever task it is that we were going to do? And so you see from this figure here, there's a lot of back and forth and backwards flow, almost like kind of a reverberating circuit, as we talked about before, back in neuronal pools or circuits. And the idea behind this is very simple. I mean, often enough, we will ponder what it is we're going to do. And the example I like to use, and I know this is kind of a silly, funny example, but it's a nice current example of our current times socially. Texting is fantastic for this, because there's nothing like receiving a text and looking at that text, and I'm sure we've all had similar experiences like this, where you look at a text and you just don't know how to interpret that. Is that person being rude? Is that person being nice? Are they just being is it just a quick response and they didn't really think much about it? And so you have to wonder, well, what did that person mean? What did that, what do they mean by that text? Was it, and if it's rude, then all of a sudden your decisions are going to be very different. If they're sending a rude text, then you'll likely respond in kind, or respond with some kind of blow you off kind of text. But if they're responding in a nice way, then you'll obviously not want to respond that way. And so you might go back and forth on your decisions as to what you how you're going to respond before you ultimately respond. And that's where a lot of this information comes from. We're going to continue to go back and forth as to what it is we're going to do before that decision is ultimately made. Now, where information is processed and where motor controls are depend entirely on how complex that system is. Simple reflexes, right, are going to be simple. And so they require the lowest level of motor control in respect here. So simple reflexes that stimulate motor neurons are going to represent low control. The nuclei controlling these reflexes are typically either in the spinal cord or the brainstem. Brainstem nuclei typically participate in more complex reflexes, but the highly variable, the really complex voluntary motor patterns, not patterns, by the way, that is a mistake there. Motor patterns are controlled by the cerebral cortex. And so again, highly variable, complex, voluntary patterns. These are going to be universally controlled by the cerebral cortex because they're variable, because they're complex. Now this is kind of a fun example because I loved using this example. Here's Wernicke's area, which is often considered to be the association area for formulating what you're going to say. And then the motor speech area is what you actually say, how you actually say what it is you're going to say. And the example I always use was my stepdaughter years ago, who used to consistently wake up in the middle of the night. And she'd wake up and she'd stand right next to the bed. And she would just kind of stand there like a zombie, which is always in and of itself very creepy. And I'd wake up and then freak out, momentarily. Everybody, if you see something in the middle of the night or when you just wake up, it's it makes you jump or startled. And so after that whole response, she would look at me dead in the face and say the most ridiculous things, like "there's bees in the bed," or "there's a bear in the driveway," or just ridiculous kinds of very nonsensical sentences, things that didn't make sense, things I know that she didn't mean. And at first I didn't quite get it. I didn't understand what was going on there. And then as time went on, I recognized that there was really only one thing that she meant every single time this happened. She just had to use the bathroom. The problem was that Wernicke's area was likely telling her the exact right thing to say. But the motor speech area, this is the association area where this is all about what to say. But then the motor speech area is how it's actually said. And there was some miscommunication between these two areas in the brain. And so when she really meant to say, "I've got to use the bathroom," what she invariably always said was something that couldn't have been further from that. And that's because there was some miscommunication there as she was so exhausted, or probably sleepwalking or whatnot, between these two association areas as to what it is that she was going to say. Okay, now, this stuff is always interesting to me. Again, a lot of things are, but I love this left brain, right brain notion. Like somebody's left-brained or somebody's right-brained, and we determine that by the things that they're best at or worst at. And that makes sense, and yet in a lot of ways it doesn't make sense. I'm going to come back to breaking that down a little bit, because nobody is left-brained. Nobody is right-brained. We are globally brained. This is a whole brain function, but some of us might be stronger in certain areas, weaker in certain areas for obvious reasons. Each hemisphere is specialized for certain tasks, and so that correlates really nicely with the idea of somebody being left-brained or right-brained. But again, you can't be one of the two. Left hemisphere is typically referred to as the categorical hemisphere. This is the one that's great with categorization, with symbolization, and specifically, it's got some very specific functions to it. For one thing, Wernicke's area and motor speech area, the two areas that I just got done talking about, these are both located specifically on the left hemisphere, right? So it's specialized for language abilities. But on top of that, it is that hemisphere that is particularly good at performing sequential and analytical reasoning tasks. So those tasks that we often associate with science and mathematics. And in addition to that, it seems to be very quantitative in the respect that it appears to directly partition information into smaller fragments for analysis. And the best way that I can make an example of this is to ask, what is 60 by 73? What is the sum of 60 plus 73? Now, it doesn't really matter which numbers I pick here, but I like to pick a couple of double-digit numbers just because it helps make things a little more complex, right? Now, if I ask you, add 60 to 73, and I give you a minute, I guarantee you that there's going to be several different ways that people come to the right answer in this one. Some people are going to directly add 60 to 73 and get 133. But some people are going to add 60 plus 60. They're going to get 120. And then they're going to add that other 13 from 73, and they're going to get 133 overall. Some people are going to add 60 and 70 and get 130. And then they're going to add the extra 3 and get 133. So this is all that partitioning that I was talking about, right? And that is kind of key here to the understanding of left hemisphere and its direct kind of specialties, so to speak. Now, again, nobody is left-brained or right-brained. And I'm going to give you a really good example of this, right? So I'm a biologist, right? Scientists are often considered to be left hemisphere people, right? Just by sheer nature of the work that we do and what we gravitate towards. And yet, I'm relatively terrible at speaking other languages, right? I've got English down. I've got truck stop English down, or Bears game English down, depending on how you think of it, where it's more foul-mouthed kind of stuff. And I've got but regular English. But that's about it, right? I don't speak a ton of languages, but I'm very good at math and science. So if you were truly a left hemisphere person, you would imagine that person would be good at everything the left hemisphere does. And they would have a hard time with the things that the right hemisphere does. But it's not a functional way to look at the way the brain actually works. We might be stronger in certain areas, but again, the brain is global, so you're using both hemispheres. And so I'm gonna come back to this when I talk about the right hemisphere, right? Because the right hemisphere is what we think of as not the categorical, but rather the representational, right? And so this one represents kind of visual spatial relationships and analyses of this, which sounds really complicated, but it's really not. I'd ask the question in a traditional lecture, how many of you have ever moved from one home to the next, and you've put all your things and you've organized them in that new home. And for the first few nights that you get up, maybe in the middle of the night, right? For whatever reason, and you get up and you're exhausted and you're half asleep, and whereas in your normal home, you would know exactly where everything was, and so you could walk around pieces of furniture, your bed, for example, and you knew where the door was for the bathroom, where the light was going to be, and all of those things. But in this new home, because those memories haven't been concreted yet, they haven't been really truly instilled and stored in your brain yet, those first few nights are like dangerous because you're running into things easily because you're not paying attention, because you don't know where these things are, because those memories haven't been instilled yet. Those visual spatial relationships aren't there. Whereas for those of you that have lived in a place in a while, just like I have in my home, if I asked you right now to picture what your living room looks like and where everything is, I bet you could close your eyes and form that mental image and see where everything is and know about how far each thing is from each other. I know I could do the same thing about my home. Now, again, I would often be considered a left brain person, and yet that is clearly a right brain or a right hemisphere task. Other skills, other functions involved with the right hemisphere: imagination, insight, musical and artistic skills, right? Perception of patterns and spatial relationships. This goes back to the idea of visual-spatial relationships we just talked about. Comparisons of sights, sounds, smells, tastes. We can't just be one hemisphere or the next. And I guarantee you that all of you can find at least one task in each hemisphere that you are particularly strong at, or you would say you're reasonably good at. Now, both cerebral hemispheres must remain in constant communication, because if they did, they'd be like two entirely separate siblings, never communicating and doing vastly different things, trying to make the same household work. It just doesn't work. Right? So there's constant communication through the commissures, and in this case, the commissure we're talking about here is the corpus callosum. These are hundreds of millions of axons that pass between both of the hemispheres and allow for these two hemispheres to coordinate and to communicate. This figure, again, is weird. I'll tell you why. One, here's the right hemisphere, here's the left hemisphere, and right between it is the corpus callosum. Now, there is never this much space between the two hemispheres. In this image, these hemispheres have been spread apart, which is a very, very bad idea in somebody's actual brain, but it's been spread apart so you can see these structures. So just keep that in mind. Now, the things I want to point out again, here's that corpus callosum. These are those axons that project between the two hemispheres to make sure that they can constantly communicate. The other aspect that I wanted to show you here is if you look at the purple shading versus the green shading, and you look at both eyes, you'll notice that each eye has both a green and a purple field. And these relate to pathways that decussate. So we're talking specifically about the pathways that pass from one side of the body to the opposite side of the brain. So for example here, the right visual field here will get sent from this right eye, and it will decussate over to the left hemisphere for interpretation by the left occipital lobe. Now, it will also send information from the left visual field here over to the right occipital lobe for interpretation. And so will the left eye. So both eyes have decussating pathways, and it's an excellent way to look at decussation and how those pathways work.